Regarding Europe, Europe is neither clearly winning nor actually losing here, since the balance in other goods already existed and will eventually show itself elsewhere. However, he simply wanted to appear even more generous than with Europe. When Ahmad Jaras arrived, Europe and European delegations began to partially lift sanctions, but he did it completely, just like that. In other words, he's making it clear that, for example, the states haven't gone anywhere, and Hezbollah remains the main player in this world.
So the context is, as I understand it, the conversation with Putin, right?
Shall we touch on that?
Well, you see, the reason is because it's actually quite important. Okay, just wait a second. Let me first, hold on, what exactly did Putin say again? So what did Putin say specifically? So Putin said as follows. Putin described it well there in his statement. He characterized it. Then Ushakov, Putin's aide, said that during their conversation they didn't want to be the first to end the discussion, and they addressed each other by their first names. Then Putin said that, in his view, the conversation was overall productive, and that we just need to determine the most effective ways in order to move toward peace. He also said that the peace agreement should eliminate the root causes of this crisis. He also said that apparently, in his view, there should be some kind of memorandum or understanding to set the framework for negotiations in order to proceed. It seems that Putin actually wants to return to the Istanbul format. And his rhetoric, his way of speaking, was along the lines of, I'm for peace. That's what Trump wants to hear, and the Americans too. And he made it clear with his whole demeanor that, like, I'm ready for negotiations, but how things will turn out next is unclear, because there wasn't really anything else significant. Trump was noticeably more optimistic about the potential outcome of the talks because he said the following. He concluded that hour-long conversation with President Rosaida Dvor-Putinova by saying he thought it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will start negotiations. That's what Putin has already said about a ceasefire, and even more importantly, about a complete end to the war. The terms will be agreed upon by both sides, as it should be. After all, I don't know the details of the negotiation process, which are not available to anyone else. The conversation's tone was great. If that weren't the case, I would say so right now, not later. In fact, they're basically shifting the responsibility for achieving peace onto Ukraine and Russia. You see, he's distancing himself. I think that if nothing's achieved there, Trump can always say at any moment, well, I tried. It just didn't work out for them. We did our best. Russia wants to restore large-scale trade with the United States. After this catastrophic bloodbath is over, I support this idea. Russia has enormous, so he offered a carrot to the Russians, saying that we'll lift sanctions and all that. Russia has tremendous opportunities to create jobs and increase prosperity. Its potential is limitless. Ukraine can also become a major beneficiary of trade attachés and the process of rebuilding its country. That's another economic carrot for both sides, but above all for the Russians, because in fact what's really on the table is the lifting of sanctions. Negotiations between Russia and Ukraine begin immediately. He writes this once again. I have informed the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, not Prime Minister Thali, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and Finnish President Alexander Stubb. It's interesting that Stubb seems to have taken on the role of some kind of spiritual advisor for him. They communicate during a phone conversation right after speaking with President Putilov. So he responded very quickly, immediately. They coordinated and efficiently. He informed them, and probably just the next step.
He hadn't done that before.
Yes, that's interesting. By the way, this is actually the most interesting part of all this. The Vatican, according to the Pope's words, expressed strong interest in holding these negotiations on its territory. Let the process begin. So the Vatican is also being brought in a way. That's interesting as well. Let's see now, what else is there? Now the reaction was interesting. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said on the social network X that it was a good conversation with the President of the United States, together with the presidents of France, Italy, blah, 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 as I mentioned earlier. I want to thank Trump for his tireless efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine. US must stay involved. We will support Volodymyr Zelensky's efforts to achieve a lasting peace in Ukraine. For now, just a general phrase.
In general, it is generally understood that, as a general rule, overall, it will start immediately. This hasn't happened in Rosenia before. This conversation sounds really sweet sounding, but actually I think it's a threat to Putin that they've played a lot of games already showing off in Saudi Arabia, and we remember the provocations that happened in Istanbul. And naturally Putin, yes, his talk is about nothing, about so-called root causes, about realities. Let's put it that way. By the way, he couldn't remember the words, taking into account the new realities. He spoke about this in a muddled way. But the very fact is, Trump actually gave him this important conversation. He gave the clear signal to actually start real, genuine negotiations for a ceasefire to take place. We need to see whether the negotiations will again have the same conditions that Russia is used to setting, conditions that seem impossible, that make it look like the country doesn't want any negotiations. Now we'll see whether Putin understood the signal or not. It seems to me that Trump's signal in the last or penultimate, in such a good conversation, Putin gives him such gifts after he is ready to strike him. And I seriously doubt that Trump will distance himself from this war for many, many reasons. Ukraine has officially become one of the strongest, or let's say most important partners for the United States. Plus, the whole world is watching how the United States behaves in Ukraine. This is being watched by, among others, Saudi Arabia, the Arab world, South Korea, and Japan. And everyone understands this. Also, if Putin is ultimately victorious in this war, in the context of the ongoing conflict with Ukraine, it means there will almost certainly be another war with Europe in the future. A war in Europe is not beneficial for the United States because then it can't negotiate with a poor Europe. That's why always, and this was probably mentioned in one of the first BBC interviews with Biden, the former president, he said that the United States has never sought to get involved in wars in Europe with a bed of hands. And we came up with NATO to prevent war there. So anyone who thinks we can just watch calmly is simply being foolish about this Trump situation. And Trump understands this. That's why it looks like before Trump shows a different face, just as Netanyahu will show his true face, I think he will show it too. But he's not in a hurry anymore. He already has a significant achievement. And he gave Putin this conversation as a gift. And notice, they're not even talking about meetings anymore. The Vatican has already made a statement, but now it's very important. When negotiations resume, it's crucial to watch what demands the Russian side will make this time. There will truly be a real conversation, or at least a ceasefire somewhere. If that happens, it will be a huge gift that Putin gives to Trump. And if not, then everything will be more than clear. I rule out the possibility that the states could completely, they might distance themselves, saying it's not their diplomatic failure, but they could come back as our allies. I have no doubt about that. Or at the very least, they will support us through Europe. Recently, I looked at the numbers and I found it very interesting. Do you know how much the total support for Ukraine, military, economic, humanitarian, amounts to as a percentage of the EU's GDP? It's 0.1% of their GDP. In other words, to put it simply, Trump is demanding 3.5 or 5% from NATO, while it's Ukraine that's holding back the war. If the European Union increases its spending from 0.1% to 0.2%, it would completely replace American aid. America understands this perfectly well. And this would just diminish the role of the United States in geopolitics. And today it's no secret that the Ukraine case has become a test for Trump's foreign policy. That's why his statement, "I can walk away," is just a bluff. I can separate myself completely if I want to. You fools, it's all just a bluff. He can't. The states can reduce aid, they can do things differently, but they can't distance themselves. But now, as he announced in response to the Arab countries, he said, why go to Istanbul if I'm not there? So for him, the word I carries a very strong sense of importance. He spoke well for now, let's see. And he will watch everything. Take the statement. Defense's latest is also more in favor of Ukraine. Right now, the main thing is that we understand this and prepare and improved our relationship with all of this. That's why things are changing now. Trump, who shocked everyone in the first 100 days, achieved the results and reactions he needed, and now he's starting to move forward. The next one where it might happen, I think, is most likely Britain or Europe, but definitely not a meeting with Putin, not giving him the gift of a meeting until he becomes a peacemaker.
The Europeans have strengthened sanctions against Russia after Trump's call with Putin, as reported in Berlin. And Trump also stated that sanctions are being prepared in the US Senate, but he himself supports an agreement, supports sanctions. Well, we know that Lindsey Graham, the well-known senator who has visited Ukraine multiple times, is one of the authors of this sanctions package. They are really very tough. As I understand it, this is really kind of an internal lever that Trump is currently holding firmly in his hands regarding Russia. But in any case, to be honest, from what I've heard, I don't have much optimism yet because, well, it's obvious that Moscow will be involved in the negotiation process. It's not going to back out. It's clear that this negotiation process will likely happen sooner rather than later, because it's already been said that that they'll meet and negotiations will start as early as September or continue in the fall after the Russians have carried out their offensives, although in fact
they've been doing that since 2014. It's precisely regarding the summer campaign, which is quite likely that these kinds of calls, these signals from Trump are exactly what restrain Russia. But that doesn't mean we should relax. We always need to have one defensive line after another. We need to be ready. Only a defeat of Russia in one of its offensives can contribute to real beneficial negotiations for Ukraine in these processes.
Tatiana Stanovaya, a researcher at the Berlin Carnegie Center for the Study of Russia and Eurasia, commented on this situation with the Trump-Putin negotiations as follows. It appears that Putin has found a way to offer Trump an intermediate, tangible result of peace efforts in Washington without making any real concessions. His idea is to agree on a memorandum, that is the framework document I mentioned, in which the principles and timeline for subsequent substantive negotiations. Only after that will Putin, yes, there was that kind of caveat from him, I noticed that too, that only after that will Putin agree to a ceasefire. Accordingly, the Ukrainians are expected to return to the negotiating table with the Russians to discuss the framework for future talks. And when Putin talks about the principles of negotiations, he means the conditions under which Russia might agree to a ceasefire. Essentially, we're talking about the terms of a truce. His goal is to bring Ukraine back into the Istanbul process. And apparently he has secured Trump's support for this. It can also be assumed that he is ready to accept a ceasefire as part of a broader agreement, which could include conditions such as freezing military aid to Ukraine, halting mobilization, and other military preparations. When it comes to timing, he makes it clear that Russia does not intend to wait indefinitely for these conditions to be met. Well, it really makes sense. It's quite logical.
As I said, we really need to see what the demands will be in the next round. If it's the usual, some of us have heard them all before, like handing over the 4 regions, Crimea, and so on, then there's nothing new. But if the conversation becomes more substantive, specifically about an unconditional ceasefire first and then negotiations, then it really means Putin has picked up on the signal, and then we'll see how the states react. And the fact that he's preparing a stick, well, he's also prepared a carrot. He mentioned that they might negotiate with us and so on, and that's how he's getting the stick ready. So right now, it's important to see that things won't start slowly. Let's see what this time Medinsky will start saying again. Probably.
Yes, well, in general, we're waiting for the next few days. I think if it happens immediately, then in the coming days, there should be some kind of increased activity. At this point in time, well, how should I put it? I suppose you could say that overall I'm feeling neutrally pessimistic about all of this, neither truly optimistic nor entirely negative, just somewhere in between. That's what I've gathered, because for now Putin is kind of dodging things in his usual way, slowly dragging things out. And what Vance said today, by the way, before these negotiations, that we can walk out at any moment because we're tired of this and we're honestly fed up with the positions of both Ukraine and Russia. It's clear that this is blackmail, first and foremost.
Exactly, Sasha. What do you think? Don't they understand who is really wearing them down and who actually doesn't want peace? They actually understand everything.
Merz just stated Europe and America are united on this issue. We will closely support Ukraine on the path to a ceasefire, declared German Federal Chancellor Friedrich Merz in Twitter. Europe will increase pressure on Moscow with sanctions. This was agreed upon by the US president after his conversation with Putin. Oh, now that's interesting. Well, you see, that's why the conversation isn't...
Look, Trump and his administration, let's say, gave the Europeans a cold shower so they would understand who they're dealing with, so they would quickly think about increasing their spending or their contribution to NATO. And that changed things. He made himself look like a bore, made himself look like a traitor, just as they wanted to see him. But in the end, he really shook them up. They got scared. And now it's starting to become clear that, you see, already after the conversation with Putin, he called a number of European leaders with whom he is now coordinating his position.
By the way, just to mention, here's another particularly interesting point. That came from Ushakov, who is one of Putin's closest aides. The main points he mentioned were that at the beginning of the conversation, Putin congratulated Trump on the birth of his 11th grandchild and wished him good health. Putin and Trump discussed relations between Russia and the US and normalization. The issue of a prisoner exchange between Russia and the US was discussed based on a 9-for-9 formula. Trump sees Russia as one of the most important partners for the US. They agreed to continue the dialogue on all issues, including Ukraine, timeframes. This is the most interesting part. The timeframes for reaching a possible agreement on a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine were not discussed.
Well, of course, but again, they're talking about... Anyway, now, as for those who say that negotiations for a ceasefire will start immediately, we'll see what tune they sing this time. That will be a clear signal. What will Russia sing this time? Something new, or will it be the same old thing? That's all.
Well, and the cyber attacks. All right,
I didn't quite understand. What do you mean by exchange?
They just have, as I understand it, both in the States and in Russia, there are detained citizens from both sides.
With each other, between the states, they've exchanged them like that. I think that is really what it's all about, at least in that particular sense.
All right, well, I think we'll just wrap it up here. Thank you to everyone who watched. Don't forget to like the stream and see you tomorrow. Thank you, Mohammad, for complaining.
Please.
Yes, subscribe to his YouTube channel. He actually has one, by the way. And goodbye.